There's a growing concern among many Americans about the U.S. government's management of the coronavirus crisis. 55% now disapprove of the president's handling of that crisis, which is up from 48% early March and 52% from last month.
Meanwhile, in the 2020 race, the latest Marquette Law School poll shows Biden 3 points ahead of President Trump in the critical state of Wisconsin. Here to explain the Trump campaign's approach to all of this is their Director of Strategic Communications, Marc Lauder. Great to see you, Marc.
Good to see you, Marc.
Thanks for having me.
Let me start with a broad question, which is just, what is your theory of the case in terms of what this election is going to ultimately turn on?
Well, I think it always comes down to being a choice. It's a choice between two candidates, two visions, and when you have an incumbent president on the ballot, it's also going to be about their record. So I think all of those things will be in play. And really, we're talking about polls in an election that hasn't even really started much yet.
So that's interesting, Marc, that you say that. I mean, one of the things we wanted to highlight to you is this new, Wisconsin, I'm told it's an important state. There's a large number of seniors that seem to be going towards Joe Biden only recently, only because of the coronavirus crisis. What is the way that that the campaign is thinking about tackling this seniors problem? I've seen the president begin to tweet about it a little bit more. How are you guys thinking about that internally?
Well, I think one thing we have to make sure is that we don't overreact to any polls that are taking place during the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, because you're going to see a lot of different numbers based on what people are just experiencing on the ground at that very moment. But what we're going to see as the country reemerges, as the economy gets going again, as people realize that the steps that the president took not only protected us, but also are getting us back up and running again, I think you're going to see a huge swing of support. In fact, we're already starting to see that, even with the polls that you just mentioned at the beginning of this. The president is also at his highest approval in a CNN poll. We've also got the president surging in some internal polling that we have recently put out. So I think people are seeing the leadership at work.
Let me get you to do a little analysis of your opponent's strategy. There's been kind of this debate raging within the Democratic Party. David Axelrod and Plouffe, and also Liz Smith, who was a comms director for Pete Buttigieg, put out an op-ed saying basically like Joe Biden's got to be more visible, he's got to be more active online, he's got to get out of the basement. His campaign and he himself hit back saying, look, we're up in the polls. The basement strategy is working. I mean, what do you think of their approach? Because frankly, I think there's something to be said, and I think you trust Sagar and I sort of try to shoot straight here on the show. I think there's something to be said for Biden running on the image that people want to project on him without actually being so visible in the public and making it less of a choice and more of a referendum on President Trump's leadership.
Well, and I mean, as we saw even in the primaries, that as Joe Biden hid from the voters, he did better, because every time he came out of the basement, he would trip all over himself with gaffes. But I honestly don't think that long term a cowering in the basement strategy will work, because you do have the president who's going to get this country reopened again. You'll see people going back to work. And that's what our country is based on. We go out there and we take on challenges, whether it was coming to the New World, settling the West, going to the moon. We're a country that tackles challenges, not hides from them in the basement. So ultimately, I think the president will benefit from reopening the country. And if Joe Biden continues to hide, it's going to look bad on him. And I don't think that will be very good long term.
Marc, another thing is we played some of the new ads that you guys have released. I think these are digital ads, all-encompassing strategy highlighting the China record. And it seems to be something, China seems that the Trump campaign, you guys are signaling, it's going to be something that we talk quite a bit about. Why is it exactly that this is the time that you think you've chosen this message?
Well, I think it's twofold. Number one, Joe Biden has a long record of being very weak on China. And also, the American people overwhelmingly believe, correctly, that the coronavirus emanated from China. So at a time we need strong leadership to stand up to China, not only because of the coronavirus, but also because of the economy and manufacturing and the economic side. You've got a candidate on the other side in Joe Biden who's very weak on China, whose son was paid by a Chinese bank. And what we're seeing with our ads is that this is resonating with the American people. We're actually seeing that nearly 30% of people who see this ad are less likely to vote for Joe Biden. Those are extraordinary numbers when it comes to the effectiveness of this kind of messaging.
And Mark, do you have a sense of whether that is region specific? So does it play, for example, better in the industrial Midwest, but sort of less important in Florida or Arizona? Is there any sort of region differentiation there?
Well, this is in the targeted states that our campaign is targeting, which does encompass obviously places like Florida, the industrial Midwest, but also out in the West as well. So it does cut across a lot of the geography, because I don't think it matters where you live. Most people believe China is where this virus emanated from. They need to be held accountable. And from what our polling shows is that a majority of Americans want China to be held responsible for the virus, and that they also trust the president to do so and to rebuild this economy.
Last question for you here, Mark, which is that there's a new poll from a GOP firm out of Georgia, which actually shows basically a dead heat race between Trump and Biden. Do you think that has anything to do with reopening too quickly?
I'm not sure if it has anything to do with reopening too quickly. Again, I think a lot of these polls right now are in flux just because of the situation that we are in. But what we have seen in our polling and in others is that as we continue to move forward, the people trust President Trump by about 15% margin. They trust President Trump to reopen the country, get the economy moving again. And so as that starts to happen, I'm confident a lot of these swing state polls will start to shift in the president's direction even more.
Yeah.
All right, Mark, always interesting to talk to you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for the update,
Good to talk
Mark.
to you guys.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next on Rising, one of the schisms in the current Democratic Party, whether or not to support Joe Biden. Fault line that for both deep and wide. Our friend of the show, Kyle Kulinski, is going to dive into that issue with us when Rising returns.